The wind howled through the snowy wilderness, yet a lone figure stood beside a stone-covered Quonset hut, the warmth from within defying the brutal cold outside. What began as a mocked idea was now something extraordinary, a testament to one man's relentless drive to survive the harshest winter the frontier could offer. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will be even more incredible than this one. The wind howled through the snow-covered trees, its shrill cry echoing through the wilderness like an ancient warning. The first snowfall of the season had settled heavily on the ground, each flake a tiny dagger of cold. In the middle of this frozen landscape, a single figure stood beside a Quonset hut, the edges of its roof shrouded in a blanket of white, but its core remained alive with warmth. The man who stood outside, his figure sturdy against the elements, was not a stranger to the harsh realities of the wilderness. His yellow knit cap stood out against the dark fur-lined coat that draped heavily over his broad shoulders. His thick, bushy beard, the color of frost itself, framed a face worn with the struggles of frontier life. Despite the cold, his eyes were sharp with purpose, his gaze focused on the hut, as if he could sense something only he understood. His neighbors, when they first heard of his plan, had laughed at him. They thought him mad. A Quonset hut was enough to survive the winter, they'd said, but to encase it in stone? That was absurd. There was no need for such an extravagant, impractical solution. But the man didn't care about their laughter. What they failed to realize was that his obsession with survival wasn't about following tradition. It was about defying it. He knew the risks, the dangers that came with being isolated in the wilderness, and he was determined to build something that would stand the test of time. The stone structure around his hut was not merely a layer of protection, it was his answer to the bitter cold, a test of his ingenuity, and an effort to create something that could withstand the harshest winter imaginable. Each stone had been carefully placed one by one, and though it had taken more than a month of grueling work, he felt it was worth it. The neighbors had called him foolish, but as the wind howled around him and the snow continued to fall, he felt no doubt. The stone shell was his shield, and the warmth it held within was proof of his vision. He had created something that could hold the heat for days, something that would not only protect him from the wilderness, but also from the elements that no amount of wood or steel could fend off. Turning away from his creation, the man walked back toward the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow. He had no need for approval from others. The wilderness would judge him, and that was enough. The evening fell early in the forest, the last Isha. Slivers of sunlight disappearing behind the towering trees as the cold began to creep in. The man returned to the Quonset hut after a long day of gathering firewood, his body stiff from hours of physical labor. The fire inside, though small, was enough to chase away the chill in his bones, but he knew better than to trust it too much. The cold of the wilderness could bite through anything, and if he wasn't careful, it would make itself known. Inside the cabin, he shed his heavy outer layers, the weight of his fur-lined coat and thick woolen trousers pulling him down with the exhaustion of the day. He stoked the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle, their warmth offering brief relief. But as the wind picked up again outside, rattling the edges of the cabin's walls, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. Despite the warmth inside, the man felt a nagging sense of doubt that he couldn't shake. The stone shell, while it had certainly helped, hadn't been tested against the brutal cold for long stretches. What if the storm turned fiercer? What if the elements found a way in? He had built the hut to withstand the worst of it, but no one could know for sure until it was truly tested. As night fell, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling above, the stone walls of his hut casting long shadows. The wind battered against the structure, its howl growing louder as it swept through the trees, bending them under the weight of the storm. The fire in the hearth was a flickering presence against the growing chill, but the man knew this was just the beginning. Winter had only just begun. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. The world was being transformed into a silent, frozen wilderness, and yet, within his stone hut, the man felt a small sense of security. He had done everything he could to prepare. Tomorrow the storm would rage on, but his creation would hold. It had to. The man closed his eyes and let the warmth of the fire lull him into a restless sleep, the howling wind outside a reminder of the relentless frontier he had chosen to conquer. The morning light crept through the thin gaps of the cabin's stone-covered structure, casting pale streaks across the floor. The wind had settled for a moment, as if it were preparing for the onslaught that would soon return. The man awoke to a silence that felt almost unnatural after the long night of howling winds. A blanket of snow had accumulated outside, and the cold had already made itself known in the thin air that chilled his breath as he exhaled. His breath condensed in the air as he rose from the small cot by the fire, a familiar ache in his bones reminding him of the harshness of the life he had chosen. The warmth of the fire was still holding strong, and for a moment the man allowed himself to enjoy the quiet comfort of it. But that peace was short-lived. Winter had a way of showing its teeth, and the storm that had been threatening the horizon was now coming down upon them in full force. The man stepped outside, pulling his woolen coat tighter around his chest. The snow had deepened, and the wind was picking up again, blowing the powder into swirling clouds that obscured the path ahead. He turned to look at his stone-covered Quonset hut, its rounded shape still holding strong against the onslaught of snow and wind. He had spent so many hours building it, each stone and layer placed with care, and now it was time to see if it would hold up. The wind whipped across the open clearing, biting into his skin as he walked around the perimeter of the hut, inspecting the structure. The stones, heavy and thick, formed a solid barrier against the weather, but there were still weaknesses, places where the stones didn't quite align or the snow had begun to accumulate in drifts against the base. He could hear the wind pick up again, and though the stone shell was holding strong, it wasn't enough to shield the entire structure from the extreme cold. As the hours passed, the storm intensified. The fire inside had begun to flicker, struggling to fight against the relentless cold that seeped through the stone walls, creeping in through the smallest gaps. The man had anticipated this challenge. He had built this hut to endure, but even the most well-thought-out construction couldn't shield him from the mountain's cruel winter forever. His thoughts turned to the neighbors who had mocked him for his efforts. They had laughed when he first began, called him a fool for thinking that a stone-covered Quonset could withstand the mountain's fury. They had built simple structures, not caring much for durability or extra protection. They had always survived before, they said, but that was before they faced the brutality of a storm like this one. With the wind howling and the cold gnawing at the edges of his cabin, the man wondered if he would make it through the night. He had already stoked the fire again, but even as the flames flared brightly in the hearth, they felt inadequate against the storm outside. Still, he refused to give in to doubt. The stone walls, despite their imperfections, had already proven their worth. They had kept the worst of the storm at bay for now. And as long as the fire still burned, so would his resolve. Nightfall came slowly, a quiet, oppressive darkness that settled over the wilderness like a heavy blanket. The storm had continued to rage throughout the day, its icy fingers clawing at the stone walls of the cabin. Inside, the man sat in front of the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light, his mind turning over the events of the past 24 hours. The fire crackled and popped, a comforting sound that filled the silence of the cabin, but it did little to calm the unease that gnawed at him. Outside, the storm roared louder, its fury unrelenting. The snow had piled up around the hut, a thick wall of white that seemed to close in on him from all sides. His cabin, the stone-covered Quonset, stood firm against the storm, but that sense of security had begun to fade, replaced by the knowledge that the real test was just beginning. The man had built this shelter to survive, But survival was never as simple as just enduring the elements. It was a constant fight against the weather, against hunger, against the isolation that gnawed at the soul. He had spent years in the wilderness, but it was always easier to face the elements when there was something to occupy the mind, something to break the monotony of the days. But out here, on his own, it was just the cold, the wind, and the constant weight of silence. He thought back to the mockery of his neighbors. They had laughed at his stone shell, called it an unnecessary extravagance. But as the storm continued to howl outside, he couldn't help but wonder if they weren't right. Was it really worth all the effort? Was this elaborate construction truly the answer? Or had he merely made life harder for himself with his obsession? The fire snapped, pulling him out of his thoughts. He added another log to the hearth, watching the flames leap higher. There was no time for self-doubt. Not now. The storm wasn't going to stop, and neither could he. Despite the storm's fury, the stone walls held their ground, their cold, unyielding surface a testament to the man's determination. But as the firelight flickered and the night grew colder, he realized that the true challenge wasn't the storm or the hut, it was himself. Could he push through the isolation? Could he endure the loneliness that settled in like a heavy fog, creeping into his mind, making him question everything? Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the man's heart, a quiet strength began to build. He wasn't just surviving the storm, he was proving something to himself. He was proving that he could withstand anything, as long as he stayed true to his purpose. With one last glance at the fire, he rose to his feet, stepping toward the window to see the snow falling thick and fast outside. The wind howled, but inside, the warmth from the fire seemed to push back against the storm. He had built this shelter for survival, but he had built himself for something more: resilience. The storm raged outside, its relentless fury pushing against the stone-covered Quonset hut. The wind howled, as if it were a wild beast seeking to tear everything apart, and the snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, burying the landscape under a thick veil of white. Yet inside, the fire burned steadily, its warmth a stark contrast to the brutal cold outside. The man sat by the hearth, his eyes lost in the flickering flames, his thoughts drifting as the storm continued to pound the world around him. It had been days since the storm began. The supplies he had gathered were holding strong, but the constant isolation weighed heavily on him. He hadn't seen another soul since the neighbors had last mocked him for his extravagant, stone-covered hut. Now, as the days blurred together in the harsh winter, he found himself questioning everything, even the very purpose of his solitude. What had brought him to this point? Why had he chosen this life, this difficult, demanding existence in the middle of nowhere? The wilderness was calling to him, as it always had. It was a voice he had learned to heed, one that drove him into the wild, made him a part of the land, and pushed him to survive against the odds. But in this solitude, he couldn't escape the feeling that the call was growing louder, more urgent. It was a voice that reminded him of the men he had known, trappers, hunters, and wanderers, men who had lived and died by their wits and instincts in the wilderness. But unlike those men, he had chosen something different. He had chosen not just to survive, but to build, to create something that would stand the test of time. The fire crackled as he threw another log on the flames, the warmth filling the cabin in a comforting embrace. But no matter how warm it was inside, the wilderness outside felt like an unyielding, living force, pushing at the edges of his sanctuary. The storm had brought with it more than just cold and snow. It had brought a reminder of the danger that was always lurking just beyond the horizon. He thought of the bears he had encountered over the years, the wildlife that roamed the forest, the predators that could appear without warning, ready to attack and destroy. The Quonset hut, with its stone shell, had proven itself capable of withstanding the wind and snow. But what if something more dangerous came? What if the very creatures that lived in the wild decided to test his creation? The wind shifted, bringing with it the faintest sound, a low growl that carried through the storm. The man stood up, listening intently. It was distant but unmistakable. The wild was drawing nearer, testing him, as it always had. The storm outside had become a warning, a sign that the wilderness was still in control, still watching. He gathered his things quickly, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man used to the constant vigilance required by life in the wild. His rifle, hanging by the door, was a comforting presence. He had survived many storms, but the wilderness had a way of reminding him that it was never truly conquered. It was merely endured, one moment at a time. As the wind howled outside, the man stepped out into the snow, his boots crunching on the packed snow. The cold bit at his skin, but his resolve was stronger. He had built this place, this shelter, against the storm, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the wild would test him once more. The man stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he scanned the surrounding wilderness. The storm had subsided somewhat, but the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ground in a soft, untouched layer. The wind still howled in the distance, but now there was a strange, eerie quiet. He had heard something out there, an animal, perhaps, or something else, but it was hard to be sure. His eyes narrowed as he swept the landscape. The forest around him, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign and dangerous. The wilderness had always been a place of life, of survival, but it was also a place of isolation, where a man could easily lose himself, his sense of purpose, and his grip on reality. In the distance, a dark shape moved between the trees, a silhouette against the falling snow. His heart raced. At first he thought it might be a bear drawn to the scent of food or warmth, but as the shape came closer, he saw that it was not a bear at all. It was a man, a figure wrapped in layers of fur and wool, trudging through the snow with slow, deliberate steps. The man's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but he hesitated. In these mountains, a stranger could mean trouble, and trouble was something he had no patience for. But there was something strange about the way this figure moved, the sense of purpose in each step. This was no lost traveler, no wanderer without direction. This was someone who knew where they were going, and they were heading straight for his hut. He waited for the figure to draw closer, his breath shallow, as he watched the man approach. The stranger was older, his face hidden beneath a thick beard, and his eyes were hard, unreadable. When he finally reached the clearing, the stranger stopped and glanced around as if he had been expecting something or someone. The man didn't lower his rifle but kept it ready, his finger hovering lightly over the trigger. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice carrying over the wind. The stranger didn't answer right away. He just stood there, surveying the Quonset hut with a curious expression, his gaze lingering on the stone shell. The wind howled again, but the stranger didn't flinch. "I'm looking for shelter," the man finally said, his voice low but steady. "It's been a long journey, and I'm in need of a place to rest." For a moment the two men stood in silence, the storm raging around them. The man with the rifle weighed the decision in his mind. A stranger in these parts was always a risk, but something about the stranger's demeanor, the way he had approached the hut with purpose, made him hesitate. He finally lowered his rifle, his grip still tight. "Come inside," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We'll talk inside." The stranger nodded once, his eyes grateful but wary. The man turned and led him toward the stone-covered Quonset hut, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the deep snow. Whatever the stranger's story was, it was clear the storm had brought them together, and in the wilderness that was enough for now. The door of the stone-covered Quonset hut creaked open, and the stranger stepped inside, his heavy boots leaving tracks in the snow. The warmth of the fire immediately embraced him, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the heat soak into his chilled bones. The man who had been sitting by the hearth didn't speak at first. He watched the stranger carefully, noting the weariness in his gait, the deep fatigue etched into his face. "Sit," the man said, nodding to a chair by the fire. "I'll get you something to warm up with." The stranger didn't need any more encouragement. He moved stiffly to the chair, his legs clearly sore from the long trek through the snow. As the man poured him a mug of warm tea, the stranger's eyes lingered on the walls of the cabin, his gaze drawn to the stone structure that encased the Quonset hut. He was no stranger to wilderness survival, but this was unlike anything he had ever seen. "What is this?" the stranger asked, his voice rough from the cold. "This stone shell?" The man paused for a moment, looking at the stranger as if weighing whether to explain. Then, with a small sigh, he sat down opposite the man, resting his elbows on his knees. "Built it myself," he replied, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of pride. "Stone's a good insulator, keeps the cold out longer than wood can." The stranger nodded, studying the structure. "I've seen many things in my travels, but nothing like this." He took a long breath, glancing toward the fire as though gathering his thoughts. "I've been out here for months, searching for something I thought I'd find. But the wilderness, it has a way of changing you. It tests your resolve, makes you forget what you came for." His voice trailed off, and the man saw the shadow of something darker pass over the stranger's face. "What's your name?" the man asked, curious but cautious. The stranger hesitated for a moment before answering, as though the question itself required more than a simple response. "Ronan," he said at last, the name coming out with the weight of a long-kept secret. He glanced at the man as if deciding whether to continue. "I wasn't always alone," Ronan continued after a pause. "I had a family once, a wife, children. We lived in a small settlement near the river, not far from here. But the winters, they were brutal. We lost everything to a storm, to the cold, to something I couldn't protect them from." His words were heavy, tinged with regret. "I came out here thinking I could survive, thinking I could find something, anything, to make it right again. But it's harder than I thought. This place, this wilderness, it doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about whether you can keep going, whether you can survive." The man remained silent, his gaze fixed on Ronan as he spoke. There was something in the stranger's eyes, a mixture of weariness and a kind of sorrow, that made him understand more than he had expected. The wilderness had a way of claiming people, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally too. It could break a man in ways that were harder to see than frostbite or hunger. "I understand," the man said quietly, his voice softer than before. "I came out here for my own reasons, to build, to prove something to myself. But this place, it doesn't care about your reasons either. It tests you, makes you face yourself." Ronan looked at the man, his gaze sharp. "And you? Have you found what you came for?" The man sat back, his mind drifting briefly to the stone walls of the hut, the fire, the solitude. He thought about the laughter of his neighbors, the mockery of his efforts, and he thought about the storm, the challenges, and how, despite it all, the hut still stood strong. "Maybe," he said quietly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Maybe I have." The two men sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, as the storm continued its relentless assault on the world outside. The storm had been relentless for days now. The snow had piled up high, blanketing the wilderness under an unyielding layer of white. The wind, however, had settled for the time being, though the air was still sharp with cold. Inside the stone-covered Quonset hut, the fire burned steadily, the warmth wrapping around the men like a protective cocoon. Ronan had been sitting near the hearth, sipping the tea the man had given him, his eyes distant. The two had talked, shared stories of their journeys and struggles, but there was an unspoken tension that had begun to settle in the cabin. It was as if the storm outside wasn't the only thing building to a breaking point. The man stood and moved toward the small window, peering out into the snow-covered world. The sky had grown dark, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch further with every gust of wind that blew past. He felt a strange sensation, a feeling that something was wrong, that something was approaching, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Ronan stood beside him, his sharp eyes scanning the wilderness outside. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked quietly. The man nodded slowly, his gaze narrowing as he watched the swirling snow. There was a presence out there, something he couldn't see but could feel. It was like a dark force moving toward them, threatening to break through the peace they had found in the cabin. The wilderness, it seemed, wasn't done with them yet. Without warning, a low growl echoed through the trees, carried on the wind. Both men froze, their hearts skipping a beat. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the shifting snow. It was the unmistakable growl of a predator, close and hungry. The man grabbed his rifle, his fingers steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "Get ready," he said, his voice low but firm. Ronan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his own rifle, his eyes hard and focused, the weariness of his journey replaced by a new sense of purpose. Outside, the growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of heavy paws crunching through the snow. The beast was close, too close. The man and Ronan exchanged a glance, and without another word, they moved toward the door. The storm outside may have shielded them from sight, but it wouldn't stop the beast from finding its way to them. The night had just become far more dangerous, and the true test of their survival was about to begin. The growl from outside had been deafening, and now there was nothing but silence. The storm continued to howl, but the ominous presence that had filled the air moments ago had faded. The man and Ronan stood near the door, their rifles in hand, listening intently. The wind rattled the walls of the hut, but it felt different now. The night no longer seemed like just a storm, but something more, something darker. Ronan's eyes flicked to the man, his expression tense. "What do you think it is?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger had known the wilderness long enough to recognize danger, but this felt different. The man didn't answer immediately. His hand tightened around the rifle, his instincts telling him to wait, to listen. He had lived his whole life in the wild, but there were moments when even the most seasoned of men could feel something beyond their control, a primal fear that gripped the chest and made the air feel thick and suffocating. It was then that the growl came again, closer this time, and unmistakable. The man felt it in his gut, a bear, a large one by the sound of it, but something was wrong. It wasn't just the proximity or the fact that it was a bear. There was something in the air, something that didn't feel right. This wasn't a random encounter. This animal had been watching them. With a grim look, the man moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. The dark silhouette of a massive grizzly stood at the edge of the clearing, its hulking form barely visible against the snowy backdrop. It was enormous, its size almost unnatural, and it was circling the hut, sniffing the air as it moved with eerie precision. "It's been here before," the man muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Ronan. Ronan joined him at the window, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the bear. "It's sizing us up," he said, his voice laced with tension. "It knows we're here." The man nodded, his mind racing. The stone-covered Quonset had held up well against the elements. But a bear? A bear could tear through most cabins in a matter of minutes. This wasn't just about surviving the storm anymore. It was about surviving the wilderness itself, and it was testing them, pushing them to the edge. The bear's growl echoed again, louder this time, as if it were challenging them. The man could feel the fear creeping in, but he shoved it down, focusing instead on the only thing that mattered: survival. They had to act, and quickly. The creature was too close, and if it chose to break through the door or the walls, there would be nothing they could do to stop it. The man turned to Ronan, his face grim. "We can't wait for it to make the first move. We have to be the ones to strike first." Ronan nodded, his expression hardening. He had faced danger before, but there was a cold resolve in his eyes now, something that made the man believe Ronan would follow through. Together, they could make it through this. The man checked his rifle one last time, ensuring it was loaded. He turned to Ronan, his voice low but firm. "When it comes, aim for the head. Don't miss." The door opened, and the cold night air rushed in, mingling with the warmth of the fire. Outside, the bear's growls had become more frantic, as if it knew its time was running out. Together, they stepped into the storm, rifles in hand, ready to face the beast that would either be their downfall or their salvation. The storm outside was no longer just a fierce winter gale. It had become the backdrop to something far more primal. The air was thick with the growls and roars of the grizzly bear as it circled the stone-covered Quonset hut. The man and Ronan stood together, their breaths visible in the frigid night air, the wind biting at their exposed skin, but there was no time to focus on the cold. There was only the bear, a force of nature that would not be stopped unless they acted quickly. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the clearing, his eyes never leaving the large, hulking figure of the grizzly. It was close now, too close. The bear's massive paws left deep prints in the snow as it moved with unnerving stealth, despite its size. The growls continued, reverberating through the night, and the man could feel the tension mounting. "We need to draw it away from the hut," the man whispered to Ronan, his voice tight. "We don't want it too close. It'll find a way inside if we let it get too comfortable." Ronan nodded, tightening his grip on the rifle. He was steady, focused, but the fear was there, faint but unmistakable. The wilderness could break a man, could strip away all the bravado, and leave only instinct. And right now, both men were relying on that primal instinct to survive. The man moved first, stepping out from the shelter of the hut into the storm, his footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of snow. The bear's head whipped around at the sound, its black eyes locking onto him with a terrifying intensity. The creature paused, sniffing the air, and for a moment it seemed uncertain, but only for a moment. The man held his breath, waiting for the right moment. He had seen bears before. He knew their behavior, their instincts. This one was no different. It was hungry, driven by desperation, and the need to assert dominance over its territory. Suddenly, the bear charged, its massive form hurtling toward him with terrifying speed. The man's heart stopped for a moment, but his training kicked in. He took aim, steadying his rifle, and, squeezing the trigger, the shot rang out through the night, and the bear faltered, its massive body recoiling from the impact, but it wasn't enough. The grizzly roared in pain and fury, its eyes now filled with a dangerous rage. It had been wounded, but not fatally. The man took another step back, trying to keep distance between them. Ronan was already moving, his rifle raised, but the bear was closing the gap far too quickly. Without thinking, the man dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bear's snapping jaws as it lunged at him. The force of the animal's attack sent a wave of snow into the air, but the man managed to roll to his feet just in time, heart hammering in his chest. Ronan fired again, the shot finding its mark this time. The bear let out a deafening roar and staggered, its legs buckling beneath it. The man saw his chance and aimed once more, this time aiming for the head, the only place that would end it. The shot rang out with deadly accuracy, and the grizzly collapsed to the snow with a final guttural grunt. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm raged on, but the immediate danger had passed. The bear lay still, its massive form sprawled in the snow, a testament to the raw power and fury of the wilderness. The man and Ronan stood in the silence that followed, their rifles still raised, but the fight was over. They had survived. Together they had faced down the wilderness itself, and for now they had won. But as the wind continued to howl and the storm raged on, neither man could shake the feeling that the wilderness wasn't done with them yet. The grizzly's massive form lay still in the snow, its blood staining the white ground beneath it. The man and Ronan stood side by side, their chests heaving with the weight of the battle they had just endured. The storm continued to howl around them, but in that moment there was a strange, almost surreal calm that settled over the two men. The wind had quieted slightly, as though it, too, was taking a breath after the chaos. The crackling of the fire inside the Quonset hut seemed miles away, though the warmth it promised was still very much needed. They had faced death in the rawest form, an enormous beast that had come within inches of tearing them apart. But somehow, against the odds, they had survived. Ronan was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, his breath visible in the cold air. "That was too close," he said, his eyes still locked on the bear's lifeless body. "I've faced many predators in my time, but none like that. It wasn't just hunger driving it, it was pure instinct." The man nodded in agreement. The bear had attacked with a ferocity that seemed different from the usual predatory charge. It was as if it had been lured, driven by more than just the need to hunt. The wilderness had a way of changing creatures, turning them into something unpredictable. The man had known the dangers of the wild all too well, but this was something else, something far darker. The storm's wind picked up again, and the man turned toward the hut. "We need to move it before the snow buries it completely. Ole," he said. His voice was steady, but the weight of the situation still hung heavily between them. They had survived the bear's attack, but the work wasn't over. They had to secure the area, ensure that the threat was truly gone, and make sure the wilderness didn't take advantage of their weakness. Ronan followed the man as they moved toward the fallen bear. They both knew the next step wasn't just about the immediate danger, it was about survival in the long term. The wilderness was unforgiving, and even a dead bear could pose problems if left unchecked. Scavengers, wolves, or even another predator could be drawn to the scent. Together they used ropes and the makeshift sled they had used to haul wood, dragging the bear a safe distance away from the hut and into the forest. The snow had begun to fall again, thick and fast, as if the world was eager to cover the evidence of the struggle. By the time they had secured the animal, their hands were numb, their muscles aching from the exertion, but the danger had passed for now. As they returned to the Quonset hut, the man could see the tension in Ronan's shoulders, the weariness in his movements. They had fought hard, but the fight wasn't just against the bear, it was against the very nature of the wilderness. And for now, they had won, but it was a victory that came with a price. Inside the hut, the warmth of the fire seemed even more inviting now, as though it too was offering a moment of respite. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time in days the man felt the weight of the night settle, as if the wilderness had, for the moment, granted them a reprieve. The night dragged on with a stillness that only the wilderness could provide. Inside the Quonset hut, the man and Ronan sat in front of the fire, its warmth now a welcome comfort after the brutal encounter with the grizzly. The air inside was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. The storm continued to rage outside, but the men were no longer focused on the wind or the snow. For a moment there was peace. Ronan was the first to break the silence, his voice low and steady. "I've spent years out here in these mountains, but I've never faced something like that. It was a different kind of fear, not just from the animal, but from the wilderness itself. It's relentless." The man looked up, meeting Ronan's gaze. "It always is. The wilderness doesn't care about you or your plans. It's not your enemy, but it's not your ally either. It simply is. It'll test you, shape you, break you if it has to. The trick is surviving it, not fighting it." Ronan gave a small, bitter chuckle. "I've spent so much of my life fighting. First, I fought to make a living, then to protect what I had left, and now I'm fighting just to stay alive." He paused, staring into the fire, as if the flames held the answers to questions he had been carrying for too long. "I used to think that survival was just about strength, but now I wonder if it's about something else, something I've been missing all these years." The man said nothing at first, letting the words hang in the air. He had learned long ago that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about the will to keep going, about the ability to adapt to what the wilderness threw at you. "Survival is a lot of things," the man said slowly. "It's strength, yes, but it's also patience. It's understanding. It's accepting that you're not in control. The wilderness doesn't care if you're strong or weak. It just asks if you're ready to face it every single day." Ronan looked up, his eyes tired but thoughtful. Maybe that's what I've been running from all this time. Not the wilderness, not the cold, but the idea that I have to accept it. I've always tried to control everything, my life, my fate. And here, I've learned that I can't. The man nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle between them. He knew all too well the struggle of accepting the things you couldn't change. It was what had driven him to build the stone-covered hut, to create something that could withstand the storms. But even the best-built shelter could not stop the wilderness from testing you. Outside, the wind howled again, but inside the hut, the fire continued to burn steadily. The man and Ronan sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was an understanding between them. The storm would pass, as it always did, but the wilderness would remain, and so, too, would they. The question wasn't whether they could survive, it was whether they could live with the wilderness, accept it for what it was. As the fire crackled, they both realized the truth in that moment. The wilderness wasn't just a force to be fought, it was a way of life. A harsh teacher that would never stop demanding more from them, but it was also a place where, if you were strong enough, you could find something beyond survival, something worth fighting for. The fire in the Quonset hut flickered and crackled, casting long shadows across the walls as the wind howled outside. The storm had not relented, though its fury seemed to have subsided somewhat. Inside, the warmth from the fire was a small comfort against the cold that had seeped into every corner of the world outside. The man and Ronan sat in quiet reflection, the heavy silence between them broken only by the occasional snap of the burning logs. The night was deep now, and the storm had buried the world outside in a thick layer of snow. But despite the calm inside, there was an unspoken weight between the two men. The bear was gone, but the wilderness had left its mark on them both. They had survived, yes, but survival was never an easy thing, and it left scars that couldn't always be seen. The wild had taken something from them, something deeper than the physical exhaustion. It had challenged their very understanding of what it meant to live. Ronan shifted in his seat, his hands wrapped around the warmth of a mug of tea, but his gaze remained distant. His thoughts, like the storm outside, seemed to swirl restlessly in his mind. The man watched him quietly, understanding the silence. There were no words to speak that could make it easier, no comfort to be offered. Sometimes survival wasn't about finding relief from the world. It was about living with the weight of it, accepting that the wilderness would always demand more, and that the only choice was to keep moving forward. "Tell me about your family," the man said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. It was a simple question, but the way it hung in the air was anything but. It was an invitation, an opening for Ronan to share the burden he carried, if he was willing. Ronan didn't look up immediately. His fingers tightened around the mug, the heat from the tea doing little to warm the cold ache in his chest. He had avoided talking about them, about the life he had lost. But there was something in the man's tone, something steady and calm, that made him feel like it was time. Time to face the ghosts that had been haunting him since he'd set foot in these mountains. They were everything, Ronan began, his voice low, almost reverent. My wife, Emma, and our 2 boys, Eli and Jacob. We lived in a small cabin by the river, surrounded by trees. It wasn't much, but we had each other. And that was enough. At least I thought it was. He paused, his eyes fixed on the wire. The words came slowly, weighed down by years of pain. That winter was like no other. The snow came early, and the cold, it didn't stop. We were used to the winters, but this one was different. It didn't let up. By the time I realized how bad it had gotten, it was too late. The boys caught a fever. Emma, she tried to keep them warm, to keep them alive, but the storm was relentless. I couldn't keep them safe. His voice cracked, but he steadied himself, looking up at the man. There's nothing like the feeling of failing the people you love. Nothing like the guilt that eats at you long after they're gone. I left that cabin behind, thinking I could outrun it. But the ghosts, they followed. They always follow." The man didn't speak right away, giving Ronan the space to let his words settle. The burden of silence hung heavily in the room, but the man understood. The wilderness didn't just take lives. It took memories, it took peace, and it took the things that made a person who they were. Ronan had come out here to escape, but he would never outrun the pain. After a long moment, the man spoke, his voice calm and irresolute. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about facing the things you've lost and learning to live with them. The wilderness, it doesn't let you forget. It demands that you face yourself. That's why we're still here. Ronan nodded slowly, his gaze distant again, but something in his eyes had softened. The storm outside may have raged, but the fire inside the hut, though small, was still burning. And in the quiet, they both understood that survival was as much about enduring the quiet moments as it was about fighting the storms. Days passed in the Quonset hut as the storm continued its relentless assault on the wilderness outside. The wind howled with a force that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the stone-covered shelter. Inside, the warmth of the fire offered a brief respite, but the men knew that this was only temporary. The wilderness outside would not relent, and they would have to face it again, just as they had faced the bear. But the encounter with the grizzly had changed something in both of them. The battle had been brutal, and though they had won, it had left its mark. They had fought for survival, but the question lingered. What came next? They had survived the wilderness, but the wilderness had tested them, shown them the rawness of life in a way they had never expected. Ronan sat near the hearth, staring into the flames as they crackled and popped. His eyes were hollow, as though the weight of everything, his past, the bear, the wilderness itself, had finally caught up with him. The man had been watching him for some time, but now he finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You can keep running," the man said, his gaze steady. "But the wilderness will always find you. It will keep testing you, keep asking you to face what you've lost. You can't outrun it, not for long, but you can learn to live with it." Ronan looked up, his expression unreadable. "And what if I don't want to? What if I don't want to face it?" The man didn't answer immediately. He simply sat there, his eyes meeting Ronan's. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "You can keep running, or you can face what's in front of you. The wilderness may be harsh, but it doesn't care what you choose. It only cares if you survive. And sometimes survival means accepting the things you can't change." Ronan turned back to the fire, his face pained, but the truth of the man's words settled into him. He had been running for so long, trying to escape the pain, the loss. But the wilderness had a way of forcing you to confront yourself, of stripping away the distractions until all that was left was you and the world around you. The man stood, moving toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. "I've built something here, Ronan," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's not perfect, but it's enough, and it's been enough for me." Ronan remained silent, but he knew the truth in the man's words. The wilderness had tested him, broken him, but it had also given him something, a chance to face what he had lost and survive. Maybe that was all anyone could ask for. Outside, the wind howled again, but inside the hut there was a sense of quiet resolution. The storm would pass, and when it did, the men would face whatever came next. Together, they would face the wilderness, not as enemies, but as part of the world they had chosen to live in. The storm had finally passed, leaving a blanket of white over the wilderness. The fire in the hut crackled softly as the man watched the snow fall outside, his breath fogging up the window. The world was still, almost serene, but the weight of the past days hung heavily in the air. Ronan sat near the hearth, lost in thought. The man spoke quietly, breaking the silence. "You've been quiet." Ronan's voice was steady, but tinged with fatigue. "I've been running for so long, from my past, from my pain, But the wilderness doesn't let you run. It forces you to face it. The man nodded, understanding. The wilderness doesn't care. It doesn't let you forget, but it also doesn't hold you prisoner. What matters is how you face it, how you keep going. Ronan stared into the fire. I'm learning that. Maybe that's enough. For now. There was a brief silence as the weight of those words settled between them. Outside, the storm had faded into a quiet, snowy world. But inside the hut, the two men shared something deeper now, a quiet resolution. They had faced the wilderness, and for the first time, they both understood what it meant to truly survive. The morning light poured into the hut as the storm settled into a peaceful, snowy silence. The man watched Ronan step outside, following his footprints in the snow. The wilderness was calm now, but the world was still vast, and survival was never guaranteed. Ronan stood by a stream, his back turned to the man. I'm not running anymore, Ronan said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. The man approached, standing beside him. Facing it doesn't mean forgetting. It means accepting what you've lost and moving forward. Ronan nodded slowly. Maybe that's enough. The man could see the change in him. The wilderness had tested them both, but it had also given them a deeper understanding of what it meant to endure. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were learning to live with the land, to accept it for what it was. Together, they walked back to the hut. The storm had passed, and while the wilderness remained unforgiving, they had come to terms with it. The real battle had been within, and now, for the first time, they were both ready to face what came next. The snow continued to fall, but it was no longer a storm of fury. The world outside had transformed into a quiet, white expanse. Everything softened, as though the wilderness itself had taken a deep, calming breath. Inside the stone-covered Quonset hut, warmth and light provided solace against the cold. The man and Ronan had lived through the worst of it, and now they found themselves facing a different kind of challenge, the slow, unspoken process of recovery. The fire flickered softly, and for the first time in a long while, Ronan seemed at peace. He had taken a deep breath of the cold mountain air and found something he hadn't expected: clarity. The wilderness hadn't broken him, it had reshaped him. As he sat near the hearth, Ronan looked at the man, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. I think I've finally accepted it, he said softly. What I've lost, and what I can still hold on to. The man nodded, his eyes steady. It's never easy to let go, but the wilderness doesn't give you a choice. It makes you face what's in front of you. Ronan leaned back, his shoulders less tense than they had been when he first arrived. I came out here to escape, but now I see. I came out here to find something too, to rebuild. The man smiled faintly. It's not about escaping. It's about finding a way to live with it all. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the fire crackling in the quiet hut. Ronan had come to terms with his past, but the wilderness had given him something in return, peace in its own harsh way. And now it was time for both of them to move forward. They would continue to live in the wild, to face its challenges, but there was no longer fear in Ronan's eyes. There was only the acceptance of what had come and the hope for what would come next. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden light over the snowy expanse outside. The storm that had gripped them for days had finally passed, leaving the wilderness peaceful, almost serene. The man stood outside the Quonset hut, his breath misting in the cold air. The mountains loomed around him, vast and indifferent, but they no longer felt like an enemy. They were a part of him now, just as he was a part of them. Ronan emerged from the hut behind him, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. His eyes were clearer than they had been when he first arrived. The weight of the past still lingered, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a part of his story, just as the wilderness had become. Do you think we'll ever get used to this? Ronan asked, his voice soft, almost reflective. The man turned to face him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't think you ever get used to it. But you learn to live with it." They both looked out at the vast wilderness ahead, the snow-covered mountains stretching as far as the eye could see. There were still dangers out there, still challenges, but for the first time, the man didn't feel the weight of them. He felt something else, the quiet certainty that he and Ronan had the strength to face whatever came. The wilderness had changed them. It had taken from them, tested them, and broken them down. But it had also given them something they hadn't expected: resilience, peace, and a deeper understanding of themselves. "Let's move forward," the man said, his voice steady. "The wilderness is still here, but we're different now. We know what we're capable of." Ronan nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "Yeah, we are." And with that, the two of them began to walk, side by side, into the wilderness. The journey hadn't ended, but they were no longer afraid of what it held. They had survived. And now they would thrive.